The journey with Jesus is the point. That's where the transformation happens, not in some obscure arrival. Hi, church leaders. My name is Doug Parks, and welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. This is Aaron, my co-host, and today, Aaron, I want us to dive a little deeper into this multiplication idea, and how do we really help church leaders get back to getting this mindset first in themselves, and then their staff and churches and even boards. So I'm going to back up. On a previous episode, we talked, if you listened before, about multiplication, and it's one of those fun, buzzy church words in church leadership right now. And, for the most part, I think it got really convoluted, Aaron, when multiplication got talked about more as an institutional organizational multiplication. Like, are you multiplying sites? Are you multiplying church plants? Campuses, and it really got us away from the root level, in my opinion. So I just would pause here for a minute, and I'd ask you two things. Number one, what's your take on that idea of institutional multiplication? And then secondarily, walk back again and give us a good, crisp definition for what multiplication in a local church looks like.
Yeah, for sure. I think, first of all, institutional multiplication is not bad in and of itself. Multiplying sites, multiplying church plants, multiplying all those things, none of that's bad. But when that's the only kind of multiplying we're doing, I think we've lost Jesus' kind of original call to multiplication, which was never about institutions and was always about individuals. And so it was always about, you have received good from God, now go and give that good away to others. And so multiplying is just taking the good we've received and offering it to others so that they can take that good and offer it to others so that they can offer it to others, and so on and so forth. And so I think we have sacrificed like personal multiplication, like who am I sharing good with so that they can share it with others? We've sacrificed that in many ways for this institutional, like, well, if the institution is multiplying, then I'm good, And I think Jesus' invitation for all of us is that each of us would be multiplying. And so actually I would just invite maybe our listeners to consider, as we have this conversation, yourself, like, how do you personally think about multiplication? And maybe how are you personally, not in your institution if you're a church leader or whatever, but how do you personally like live this? And if you don't, no condemnation, but I think it's a worthy thing for us to all be reflecting on as we have this conversation.
Yeah, our home church, Aaron and I both attend Canyon Ridge Christian Church in Las Vegas, listeners. And so in our home church, we've been through I can't remember now, Canyon Ridge is, I think, over 30 years old, and was a church plant, grew very quickly in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s. And I kind of want to get you to give a history of the last few years, kind of an A-B comparison. So when you think about this multiplication mindset and you think about the elders of the church in 2018 or 19, and you think about the staff of the church in 2018, 19, where was it kind of at? How would you describe the multiplication mindset of the board of elders and the staff, not the congregation yet, 4 or 5 years ago?
So I joined the staff here in 2019, at the end of 2019. And so I can really only offer context from then. But I would say, even as a staff member, myself, jumping on a team, and what I observed around me and the limited knowledge I had at the time of our elder board, I would say we use a very fancy term, which I'll explain. We call it like multiplication fluency. And what I mean by that is, like, how fluent are we at knowing what multiplication really is and being able to actually multiply things? So, like, in the simplest terms possible, like you said, multiplication is this buzzword. Do we actually know what it means? And would we actually know how to do it if we were told you need to go multiply something today? And I would say our multiplication fluency was zero. We knew it just because we know that's a fancy church word that people use, that we're to multiply, right? But in terms of practice of that, I would say we had very little understanding of like the New Testament mandate to multiply. And what I mean by that is like to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And so we set out when COVID hit, it was kind of the perfect opportunity to say, okay, we realized very quickly that without the institution, our people did not know what to do. And that was nobody's fault. It just was when there wasn't a church building to come to and the church staff wasn't available, to offer whatever it was that we offered before, people were floundering. And our staff was floundering. Our elders we were all floundering to figure out, what are we going to do next? And I know many of our listeners can relate to this because we all had that moment in 2020 where we were all floundering. Personally, yes. Professionally, all the above, right? But
although we all had PTSD. So we're going let's like,
yeah.
No more COVID. We're not going to talk about COVID, but go ahead and talk about the State of the Union. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, for sure. So in that moment, it was an opportunity to say, what do we hope is true of us? And how are we going to find our way out of this? I don't want to pretend like that was the first questions we asked because we had to flounder for a while before we got there. But eventually it was like, how are we going to find our way forward as a church? And so in that moment, I think one of the things that was really important is our lead pastor had this real commitment, and more than a commitment, I would say like a gut level conviction. And what I mean by that is just like this feeling like we must. That's what I mean by conviction. Like we must become a church that multiplies, not institutionally, but the individuals of this church must be equipped to go to the people in their lives and take the good they've received from God and give it away in droves. And if we are going to survive this pandemic, if we're going to survive our doors being closed, we are going to have to equip people to make disciples who make disciples. And that is a slow process. We are 3 years into this, and I feel like we're just starting to get our legs under us and even realize what we actually meant 3 years ago. We're actually now just starting to figure out, oh, that's what we meant by that. We just had to kind of practice and feel our way into some things. So
I'm going to circle back because it's so good and not a phrase I know many of the listeners are probably familiar with. Talk again about what is your definition of multiplication fluency? And then maybe now on kind of the other side of this realization, what are some ways you would encourage them practically to start having these conversations?
So multiplication fluency is how aware. So like, for example, we started on our staff. So here's a question around multiplication fluency. How aware is your staff of what multiplication means? And could they take something simple and multiply it tomorrow? Would they even know how to begin doing that? And if the answer is no, or maybe not, your multiplication fluency is low, right? Would they know how to take, even for example, like, could I take facilitating a class that I do? Would I know how to multiply that to create another facilitator just like me? Like, let's take spreading the gospel and all of that out of the conversation for a minute. Let's just take multiplying any skill. Would someone know how to do that? Well, we had to back all the way up and say, what is a skill or hobby you have? And how would you multiply that so someone else could have that skill or hobby? Like, we backed all the way up to that level of the conversation, because when you start to say multiplying disciples and spreading the gospel, it gets really philosophical and squishy. And so we literally had everyone write down a hobby that they have. And then we had them write down a name of somebody in their life that they would like to teach that simple hobby. And then we walked them through a simple process to multiply that hobby so that they could experience what it feels like, because it's not enough to just tell someone, this is how you bake my grandma's banana bread. That's not enough. You actually have to, we use a simple system called M.A.W.L. Sounds really aggressive. We're going to maul somebody. That's not what I mean. M.A.W.L, which is this: model, assist, watch, launch. So if you want to multiply something, we use this simple, and grow your multiplication fluency. We use this simple phrase all the time. We are going to maul. So you're going to model for someone. Then, Doug, if I was multiplying something to you, I would model it to you. Then I would assist you as you did it. Then I would watch you as you did it. And then I would launch you out to go maul someone else. Does that make sense? So we could do a whole podcast on M.A.W.L. There's a lot there, but to just give a snippet of where we started, that's how we just started building multiplication fluency.
No, that's great. And I have a feeling we will do that. I know that this year's conference, we've got some creative ideas on the board. The Intentional Churches Church OS conference, we've got some ideas on the board already to teach this even more. I want to back up to like inside of Church OS and Intentional Churches is this idea of the Acts 1:8 model. And just to refresh the listeners, Acts 1:8 is you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and to the ends of the earth. And it's this idea of layering out. And I think this is where the American church has drifted away from, is realizing that Acts 1:8 model is first for every believer. And that Jerusalem and Antioch, my mission field where I live, work, and play, is the root engine of true multiplication. It is not an institutional or organizational mindset. And that's what I hear you talking about. The transformation that had to happen at Canyon Ridge is, I've been there a long time and helped lead the church for a number of years. And like you said, we're doing the best that we could do. But there was a season where I would say we had the bulk of our strategies were organizational, institutional ideas, where we were looking for silver bullets for speed. Instead of what I hear you saying is we're just now 3 years in and fruit is now coming on the trees, and so
this is a go slow to go fast kind of work.
Yeah.
And that bothers me because I love going fast. And I think a lot of church leaders love going fast, but you have to go slow to go fast. So
yeah. I love this phrase. It's an old Navy phrase that the SEALs adopted: slow is smooth and smooth is fast, which is anti-modern church leadership. So, Aaron, I want to talk about, because we're trying to differentiate so much between institutional mindsets and individual or relational. I wanted you to talk for a minute about your personal journey and how your mindset has shifted to more of a personal multiplication mindset. And what are some of the things in you that changed, or tools that happened, or something that somebody taught you? What are things that changed you first?
Yeah, I think it's good because this question kind of circles back to something you were focusing on a bit ago, Doug, which was this idea of like multiplication begins in I think you used the phrase like our personal reach zones, right? What we call that, or what at Canyon Ridge is like, we call those our faces and places. Intentional Churches calls it being one aware. Whatever word you want to put next to it, it's just who is close to you but far from God. Like, who are the faces you see and the places you go? Where do you, like you said, live, work, and play, and who do you encounter in those places? And so for me, honestly, I mean, I had been a church leader for a handful of years before coming to Canyon Ridge. And I think before really like sitting with and wrestling with this like personal multiplication charge and conviction, I think I thought I was multiplying. I think I thought I was doing what God had asked me to do because I was reaching church people.
Yeah, how many of the church leaders listening right now can identify with that statement?
Yeah, I think I thought I would, and it's not that I was doing anything bad, but I wasn't living the personal mandate to go and make disciples. I was reaching church people, hoping that maybe somehow by proximity they would reach people in their lives, but not equipping them to do that. And so I had to really wrestle with the way my church staff job actually got in the way of my personal disciple making that has nothing to do with being on a church staff.
So like that's profound.
Church leaders, we are not exempt from making disciples in our personal lives. And I know that might seem obvious, but for me, I had to wrestle with that reality. That what I get a paycheck for, while good work, is actually like not all that Jesus has in mind for me. And so just wrestling with that, wrestling with this idea, we talked about it a little bit on the last episode, and we'll talk about it some more, but contribution from everyone is greater than expertise from a few. And I was one of those like so-called experts that everybody was looking to. And so I had to get out of the way. Long story short, I had to get out of the way. And so I sat down and I just started mapping out the names of the people that were close to me but far from God. And I had a couple of realizations. This was a few years ago. The first was this. I didn't have as many names as I hoped because most of my names of people I was in relationship with were in the church. And so I had this hard moment where I was like, oh my goodness, I have surrounded myself with only church people. And so how can I live this mandate to like be close to people who are far from God if I have surrounded myself in this bubble of church? And what am I going to do to get in proximity with people who don't come to the church that I work at, you know? So that was a sobering moment. And so just getting really committed about the arenas of my life. And what I mean by that is just like, where do I work out? Where do I live? What hobby or whatever other thing am I going to do to get around people who are not church people? And then being committed to both pray for those people. And I think the other piece is like engage those people with curiosity. I realized that listening well and asking good questions will go way farther than we think. And it sounds simple, but that is the name of the game, baby steps. And so I committed to praying for those people personally, and I committed to asking really good questions. And Doug, we could have 20 episodes of stories of what God has done and what has emerged because I was curious, not because of any great work I did, but because God, like these people were amazing and God just wanted to show me if I was willing to slow down. And so I think for our listeners, that would be my encouragement is, are you even aware of who is close to you but far from God? Do you know their names? And if there's not many names, what are you willing to do to get in proximity to people who are not church people?
Oh, that's so good, Aaron. Thank you for being vulnerable to everybody, just sharing where you're at. And it has to start with us. It's shocking to me as we are with church teams regularly. I will oftentimes in your introduction have you list a one in your life. And I'll define a one as someone who doesn't know Jesus yet, doesn't have a relationship with him. And so many of the church leaders, staff, it's a struggle. It's an ant in another city. And this isn't a shame or guilt thing. I'm just trying to do what you did. If we're going to have a church that truly multiplies and have a multiplication mindset, every one of us have to be modeling that in our personal lives. And that's sometimes something we blow by in church leadership today, just that it's that way. So I do want to transition to one of the concepts in multiplication I hear you talk about regularly is generational. Again, another word we need to define. And I would say it this way. How do you see, what is the importance in the personal transformation of thinking about your ones, those far from Jesus who don't know Jesus, and then theirs and even beyond? So what part does that play in shaping your personal thinking about this idea of generational multiplication?
Yeah, I think it's important to just say that we talked about this in the last episode, but generational multiplication could be viewed a couple different ways. The first is by age, from grandparents to their children to their children. Those generations matter. But I think the kind of generational multiplication we're talking about is, like you just said, Doug, like, who do I know? Like me reaching my neighbor so that my neighbor can reach the people in their life so that they can reach the people in their life and so on. And I think one of a question that somebody asked me once was, okay, so you're getting into some of this, multiplication. You're trying to think about making disciples. Tell me about your disciples. And I was like, that's a great question. I should think about my disciples. And so I think when we think about this idea of multiplication or taking the good we've received and giving it away to others, I don't know that we've truly multiplied until the people that we have handed good to have given that good away themselves. And so I think we have to create simple tools and simple ways, and the way we hand things has to be so portable and so simple that it's easily handable again quickly. And so even the way we think about studying the Bible in small groups is like, it's so simple so that I could teach someone so that they could teach someone pretty quickly.
Yeah, the whole thing was started by ordinary, ignorant men, right? Men and women.
Yeah.
And so I would say, give us a practical example of what you're saying. A simple tool that could be passed from a 1 to a 1's 1 to a 1's 1's 1. That's hard to say.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say we use a simple tool called the 3-circle gospel, where we try to share the gospel in about 3 minutes using 3 circles. And I'm sure we can provide that tool in the show notes or something like that. But it's so simple, and we do it in just a few minutes so that I can teach it to you, Doug, and you could walk away with a couple of tries at doing that and teach it to your one so that they could teach it to their one, and so on. That's a simple tool. Again, the gospel, this big, complex, weighty theological thing, and we're trying to say, yeah, we realize a simple tool doesn't capture everything that the gospel says, but it can capture the nuts and bolts enough to be potent enough to travel generationally through relational networks. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. From me to you to someone else. And so that's just one example.
Over my life, I'm a little older now, and I've realized that in Christendom, the idea of spiritual influence or relational evangelism has an incredible weight for the Christian and usually brings guilt and shame when you're talking about these ideas of faces and places and getting active out there, one aware. And so I've been really taking this posture of, let's take the blood pressure of our people down. I know it was good-hearted to say, be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks the reason for your hope. But I've really leaned into 1 Corinthians 3 over the last year or two and saying, hey, listen, church people, you may be planting or you may be watering, but it's God who gives the increase. It's not your job to close the deal unless you're following a prompting of the Spirit and you're in tune with discernment about how God is opening doors with those who are far from Jesus. And so I think we've got to help our church people get back there and feel like this is not a shameful thing, this idea of spiritual influence of our ones and our ones. Okay.
Oh my goodness. And I think that's like part of that just goes back to what we've been saying. That's why it has to be simple, because if it's complicated, if there's a lot of weight and pressure, A, people just aren't going to do it, or B, they'll be miserable while they do. And so I think part of like building this kind of multiplication mindset in our church is we have had to celebrate everything, not just like the stories that are finished, but we celebrate people that made an effort. We celebrate people who just tried. And it doesn't matter if they fell on their face. We just celebrate that they tried. We celebrate that they tried to start a spiritual conversation with their neighbor, or that they, reached out and offered to engage someone in their life. We just celebrate everything because we don't want that pressure. And I just agree that it's only God that brings about the kind of transformation that we really hope for the people in our lives.
Yeah. What are some, you have practical examples of that?
We tell simple stories on the weekends, and we're very intentional to tell stories that are sometimes on the way, that don't have a resolution yet. And we're clear to say, the story's to be continued, and we're going to see what God does. But we just celebrate anybody who takes a step in Jesus' direction. That's the language we use. And so not that has arrived with Jesus, but is just stepping in his direction. We celebrate that.
Yeah. I think that's so good. And there are other places I know, but just giving that example of like the stories we're telling in a service, how do we not always tell? We're in Vegas. Everybody wants to tell the home run story, like the miraculous whoever that came to Christ and was baptized and now they're, a pastor or whatever. But no, getting back to this, telling about the journey, because the journey is the point. The journey with Jesus is the point. That's where the transformation happens, not in some obscure arrival piece. I do want to speak a little bit. I want to talk about when you ignited this in yourself, and now we're moving to the staff and the elders. What are ways that you raise this one awareness and multiplication mindset inside of those groups of people? And do you have any stories of like some fails and some awesome results from it?
Yeah, I think first of all, we talked about this all the time. And I think at first our staff was kind of like, oh, is this going to be kind of our latest initiative? And we're going to try to be multiplying for a while and then we'll find our next initiative. I think that was honestly kind of the spirit in our staff meetings for a while was, yeah, multiplying, making disciples, that feels good. And then we'll kind of ride this out until the next thing comes around and then we'll run after the next vision or whatever. And so just continuing to hammer, even 3 years later, this is not going away. This is everything we do is centered around the Great Commission. Everything we do is centered around, all I mean by that is like, we make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And so, continuously inviting staff to be praying for the people who are close to them but far from God, giving significant amounts of meeting time, both in staff meetings and in elder meetings, to talking about our personal disciple making before we ever talked about how it applies to our programs. It's a sacrifice we had to make, but I would say that's still a part of what we do. We're actually like still working on multiplying and increasing what we've already talked about, our multiplication fluency. We're still working on that with our staff. And so that makes a regular part in our staff meetings. And so I would say to our listeners who are like, oh my goodness, where do we even begin? It's like, you're going to have to make some sacrifice. And this is going to have to be a part of your regular conversation about people's personal disciple making.
Yeah, it's so important, and it seems so elementary and Mickey Mouse what we're saying, but it's so profound. Like the gospel has survived this long because of what you're talking about, and not because of some institutional or organizational might. Bart Rendell, my co-founder of Intentional Churches, he's been talking and writing a lot recently about how our mindset as church leaders must switch from transactional to transformational.
Yeah.
And that the transactional mindset of the institutional church has really led us down this road of having capabilities in a lot of churches to have a lot of people come to Jesus and be baptized. But then the transformational part, which is literally the dying of self, that journey through the rest of your life, that is where we've really struggled. And what I hear you saying is if we just come back to the basic blocking and tackling of me having a mindset of personal multiplication as a disciple of Jesus, a lot of this is all going to take care of itself and get the ship more headed in the direction we need to be. Aaron, last thing I want to hit on today is let's talk a little bit about if like right now you're in this mode, it's 3 years in, it's a journey. What is the actual potential in this whole thing in a church? We have this tool inside of Intentional Churches called the Relational Reach Zone Calculator, where we literally could show in a church of maybe 500 where they're literally stewarding 5,000 spiritual opportunities. It literally does math to get to a spitball number of if we got let's say 70% of our people one-aware, activated, mobilized where they live, work, and play, what's the actual potential of the church? So I think I want to ask you, at Canyon Ridge, have you thought about that? Like, what is the cohesive potential of all these people that we're now getting mobilized in a way we haven't for a long time?
Yeah, I don't know that I have numbers to attach to that. I would have to sit down and really think about that. But I would say this is how we think about it and how we vision cast, is we say, we want to spark a movement of disciple makers with too many generations to count in the city of Las Vegas and beyond. And what would be amazing if we sparked that movement of disciple makers is that it's not about Canyon Ridge. Like Canyon Ridge, our name would be lost way, way long ago because it has reached so many people through their individual personal relationships. That it was never about an institution, but that Canyon Ridge just helped sparked a movement, and movements multiply and they spread like wildfire, And so I think that's the language we use to just imagine a future in this direction.
I think our time's growing short. I just had the last question. Do you have any other practical tools that a listener could take away from today and help develop more of this mindset of multiplication in themselves or the team they lead?
Yeah, for sure. I would say, first of all, a simple conversation around personal disciple making. What is the awareness on your team or where you volunteer? What's the awareness of the personal responsibility to disciple making? And then taking a moment to write down the names of the people that are close to you but far from God. I know that's a call to action we did on the last episode. I think we should do it on almost every episode because those names should be changing and growing and ebbing and flowing. It shouldn't be the same list week after week. You know, it should be dynamic. And so I would say, what is the understanding of personal disciple making responsibility and who are the names, and get after praying for those people, I think is a great place to start.
That's great. That's great. And I think, listener, my challenge to you coming out of this conversation is just this question. What will you do next to make the Great Commission more of a personal mission statement for you tomorrow than it was today? And I think if we can get back to some of that basic blocking and tackling, the potential is literally unlimited of what lies in the church in America. Hey, listeners, thanks for listening today. We appreciate you. Check out intentionalchurches.com for some resources and tools. And we'll look forward to the next conversation.